to our weekly 30 minutes of Torah study for the Torah portion of Terumah. We'll begin with an overview of the Torah portion. The people of Israel are called upon to contribute 13 materials: gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and red dyed wool, flax, goat hair, animal skins, wood, olive oil, spices, and gems, out of which God says to Moshe, "They shall make for me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell amidst them." On the summit of Mount Sinai, Moshe was given detailed instructions on how to construct this dwelling for God so that it could be readily dismantled, transported, and reassembled as the people journeyed in the desert. In the sanctuary's inner chamber, behind an artistically woven curtain, was the ark containing the tablets of testimony engraved with the 10 Commandments. On the ark's cover stood 2 winged cherubim hammered out of pure gold. In the outer chamber stood the 7-branched menorah and the table on which the showbread was arranged. The sanctuary's 3 walls were fitted together from 48 upright wooden boards, each of which was overlaid with gold and held up by a pair of silver foundation sockets. The roof was formed of 3 layers of coverings, tapestries of multicolored wool and linen, a covering made of goat hair, and a covering of ram and tachash skins. Across the front of the sanctuary was an embroidered screen held up by 5 posts. Surrounding the sanctuary and the copper-plated altar that stood before it was an enclosure of linen hangings supported by 60 wooden posts with silver hooks and trimmings and reinforced by copper stakes. So if you look at any chumash, there will be beautiful pictures, drawings, artist depictions of what it was that the temple, of what the sanctuary looked like, and the items that were utilized inside. Online, there are many websites that have beautiful pictures, paintings, and depictions as well. But this past week at the Milwaukee Community Hebrew School, we had these VR goggles, these virtual reality goggles, which took you from the outskirts of Jerusalem, walking towards the temple, into the temple and all of the rooms. It made it feel more real than anything I've ever experienced in my life. It was incredibly powerful. If you speak to any kid who was in Hebrew school this past week, their mind was absolutely blown. You're standing on the hills of Jerusalem, looking around as people are gathered together in the hundreds and the thousands making their way towards the temple, and you got to go in around the altar, the Holy of Holies. It is mind-blowing, an experience that I think we all should get. I got to talk to Chava how we can get these back, because this virtual reality tour of the temple made it more real and alive to me than I've ever experienced before. All right, let's get to the Parsha this week. So, as we mentioned, there is the command, and they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst. It is called the Mishkan. It is a portable sanctuary. It's a portable temple that the Jewish people are going to take with them as they travel through the desert. They have to disassemble it and then reassemble it everywhere they go. It's a building that had no roof. There was actually various beautiful tapestries and curtains that were draped over the top. The idea of this sanctuary was to be portable and to be temporary. However, when the Jews were going to settle the land of Israel, that is where the permanent building, a permanent structure, the temple was meant to be built. The Talmud points out that there are in fact 3 mitzvahs that the Jews are obligated to perform when they enter the land of Israel. It is taught in a brisa. Rabbi Yossi says 3 mitzvahs were commanded to the Jewish people upon their entrance into Eretz Yisrael: to establish a king for themselves, to destroy the offspring of Amalek, and to build the temple. So when the Jews enter the land of Israel, they're no longer a people without a home. They're no longer just escaping slavery, running through a desert. They now have to become a real nation and a real country. A real nation and a real country has a king which leads them. It has an army that defends them. And there must be a temple, there must be a Beis Hamikdash, a spiritual center as well. These are not just 3 items that were necessary. It actually had to be in this order. It wasn't just that three items were needed. It had to be first the king, then the army has to defeat Amalek, and only then was the temple actually able to be built. And in fact, it took a very long time. It took a few hundred years. It wasn't until the Jewish people appointed their second king, which was King David, that the project was able to begin. Why? Because number one, you had to have a king. That king had to defeat Amalek, right, and bring peace, calm to the land. Only then could the building begin. King David was a mighty warrior. He defeated the enemies of the Jewish people. He brought peace to the land of Israel. And then the temple project was able to begin. As it says in the book of Shmuel, and it came to pass when the king dwelt in his house, and God had given him rest from all his enemies, that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within the curtains. So there's peace. Now it's time to build the temple. The timing was correct. However, God said that King David, he was a warrior king. Now the temple is meant to be a house of peace, not appropriate to be built by a warrior king. The warrior king set the stage for the temple, but it must be a king of peace that builds the house of peace, and it's King David's son, Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, who is the one who actually builds the temple. There is a description of this monumental workforce that goes to build the temple. 30,000 men are sent to Lebanon to chop cedars in order to build the Beis HaMikdash. 150,000 people are tasked with the job of cutting and transporting stone. Right? This is a huge enterprise to get the amount of stones that's necessary. 3,300 people have roles of supervisors. Tremendous building project, and it takes approximately 7 years for the temple to be built in Jerusalem. Now, this leads us to a question. Why have such a lengthy wait on political affairs to build the permanent temple? Torah says that you must have a king and you must have an army with peace before you can build a temple. Why? What is the connection between having a king and an army and having a temple? The temple is about Torah, mitzvah, spirituality, holiness. A king is about government. What is the connection between the two? Why do you have to have a king first, then an army, then a temple? Now, it took 440 years from the time that the Jews left Egypt, the Torah was given to them, until they were actually able to build the temple. Now think about this. The first temple only stood for 410 years. This means that from the time the Jews left Egypt until the first temple was destroyed, they only had a temple for less than half of the time. Another way of thinking about it, right? How old is the United States? The United States was founded in the year 1776. If we compare the United States to the Jews entering into the land of Israel, they still would not have a temple built yet. Why wait so long? Why need a king? Why need an army? Why 440 years of waiting before a permanent structure, the temple, can actually be built in Jerusalem? We'll begin to understand this by understanding point number one, which is the need for a king. Why did the Jewish people need a king? Why did the Jewish people need a king in order to build the temple? The Jewish people survived for 440 years without a king. Does this mean there was no leadership? Of course not, right? There were judges, there were prophets, there was a Sanhedrin, the supreme rabbinic court. Why was there a need for a king? Yet if you look in the Torah, it's a very clear and explicit mitzvah. There's an obligation to have a king. The Torah says when you come to the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and live therein, and you say, I will set a king over myself like all the nations around me, you shall set a king over you, one whom the Lord your God chooses from among your brothers. You shall set a king over yourself. You shall not appoint a foreigner over yourself, one who is not your brother. So here we have a mitzvah for a king. What are the benefits of a king? Well, first of all, you have centralized, strong leadership. The job of the king is to ensure that there is law and order in the country. You cannot have a country where there is no law, where there's no order. King is in charge, king is responsible, king is the head. Now, it happens to be that if you look over history, we have really moved away from this style of government, right? We've moved away from a monarchy. What is popular today, of course, is a democracy, but not just a democracy, but a democracy that has very clear separation of powers. So no one branch of government can have too much power like a king. Because you know what? The idea of a monarchy did not work out very well. Very corrupt, a lot of violence, did not result in healthy people or a healthy country. Today, democracies, separation of power, the Bill of Rights, and so on. Yet, in the Torah, what form of government does the Torah recommend? The Torah recommends having a monarchy. Now, if you really think about it, there really is nothing wrong with the concept and the idea of a monarchy. The problem is the people who actually have been part of the monarchy, right? The problem is not the idea of a monarchy. The problem is the corruption of so many of the people who became the kings and the queens throughout much of history. But the idea of a monarchy is actually fantastic. Imagine a monarchy where the king was a perfectly righteous individual, a tzaddik, smart, brilliant, charismatic, talented, the ultimate leader, the ultimate unifier. What could be better? Moshe Rabbeinu, the ultimate king, King David, right? Shlomo HaMelech. This is fabulous. Maimonides, the Rambam writes in the Laws of Kings, in all matters the king's deeds shall be for the sake of heaven. His purpose and intent shall be to elevate the true faith and fill the world with justice, destroying the powers of the wicked and waging the wars of God. Sounds perfect. Who wouldn't want such a leader committed, dedicated to these goals, wearing the crown on his head? The idea of a Jewish king is not about accumulating riches. It's not about accumulating power. It's about responsibility, leadership, unifying the people, teaching Torah, mitzvahs. That's what a king is all about. Because this is what the Jewish idea of a monarchy and the Jewish idea of what a king is all about, Shmuel, right, Samuel the prophet, was actually very upset with the Jewish people when the Jewish people made their first request to have a king. Because their request was predicated on the idea, we want a king like all of the other nations who have kings. Shmuel was brokenhearted. That's what you want? Power, corruption, a dictator? You want to be like all the other nations? That's not what we want, right? A Jewish king is not supposed to be a king like all the other nations. This, what the Rambam writes, this is what a Jewish king is supposed to be all about. So it's very clear that any nation is going to need a leader, and that leader should be righteous and should uphold these particular values. But why does that person have to be a king? A person could be a president, a person could be a prime minister, and still have a lot of power, and still have a lot of impact on the country. Why specifically a king? It's kind of risky, right? So if you look at Hasidic philosophy teaches that the concept and the idea of a monarchy that we have here on earth, and especially the model that's in the Torah, parallels and really comes down to us from its spiritual source. What is the spiritual source of a monarchy, of a king on earth? It, of course, is the King of Kings. It is, of course, God himself. Because of the fact that God himself is the source of our mitzvah of a king, there's actually a bracha, there's a blessing that we make when we see a king. The blessing is, blessed are you, God, our Lord, King of the universe, who has given from his glory to flesh and blood. The flesh and blood king that we have here on earth, right, is a reflection of, is parallel to, descends to our world from God himself. God is the King of Kings, and we're meant to be in this relationship with God as a king in absolute awe of God. The same thing is what the physical king is supposed to express. The king is meant to convey and to share and to bestow upon the rest of the Jewish people a tangible sense of awe for godliness, for holiness, for spirituality. Let's look at how the Rebbe writes this. The commandment, you shall set a king over you, is about awe. In spiritual terms, a king expresses a unique degree of fear of heaven. His being is subsumed before God. And through the king, this kind of awe and self-abnegation extends to the whole nation. We're not talking about a president here. We're not talking about a prime minister. On the high holidays, when we come to shul, we do not refer to God as our father, our president, right? Our father, our prime minister, right? We don't have such language because God is a king, and a king conveys something. There's an emotion, there's a feeling, there's a sensitivity. And it's that earthly king that is meant to convey this idea about God as well. This is what a king is all about. So now that we have some appreciation of why there is a mitzvah in the Torah, that there should be a king, and what the job and the role of what a king is in the land of Israel, we can start to appreciate and understand why we cannot build a temple until we have a king, and until we have an army that defeats the enemies of the Jewish people, then you can have a temple. Because these three commandments really are the fundamental building blocks, the core of what it means to have a nation, to have a country. Without them, you have nothing. Number one, you have to have a king. The king represents law and order. Without a functioning government, without rights, without the ability to have legally binding contracts and agreements, so on and so forth, no country is possible. So to have a functioning country, there has to be a functioning government. The king is the ultimate at the head. In order for a country to function, it's not just enough that internally it's working. It's not only internally, it has a functioning economy and a functioning criminal justice system, but there also is foreign policy. There's national security. The inhabitants of that country have to feel safe and have to feel secure, not just from an attack from their neighbors, but from the surrounding countries, from any other nations. So to have a strong army that will defeat the nations that are opposed to you and bring peace to your land, you got no country. So domestic, foreign, internally, externally, critical to have a king and to have an army. And then finally, right, without a temple, without a religion, without a culture, without a common set of values of spirituality that permeates the nation, you're also going to have nothing. The only way a Jewish country, a Jewish nation can survive is with Torah and mitzvah, spirituality, a temple at the core. One of the prominent Zionist leaders, right, well over 100 years ago, I believe it was Echad Ha'am. I could be wrong, but I'm almost positive that it was Echad Ha'am. He said, it is better not to have our own country than to have a secular state. He said, it's better that we have zero country at all than for Jews to give up their unique spiritual identity just to have a government and to have the political fights and the infighting like every other country around the world. We will disappear like that. Better not to have it, right? It's critical that there is not just security and a government, but Torah and mitzvahs. Otherwise, there is no Jewish people, there is no Jewish nation. It's nothing, it's going to disappear. So based on what we just said, it's actually very logical that these three things are critical when the Jews enter the land of Israel. And it's also very logical they're in this order, because you need a king who is dedicated to building the country, law and order, responsibility, leadership, unity, to make a strong, functioning country with an economy. Critical that you have that. And then you need to protect that country from the enemies that are around it. Once you're safe and secure, you can have a temple that can grow and can flourish, and you can have spirituality permeate the country. The Rebbe, however, comments, it's not only about the order, right? It's not only about the order, but rather all three of these things are interrelated, and you simply cannot have one without the other. The Rebbe says these three mitzvahs, as Rashi says, depend on one another. In other words, although there are three separate mitzvahs, each of them also contributes to the complete picture of the other two. The mitzvah of appointing a king is fully achieved when the mitzvahs of destroying the offspring of Amalek and of building the permanent temple are complete. Similarly, with regard to the others, the complete picture of the mitzvah to build the temple is connected with fulfilling the mitzvahs of appointing a king and destroying the offspring of Amalek. All three mitzvahs are symbiotic. Appointing a king, defeating Amalek, right, having that army, and building the temple, they're all interconnected. You simply cannot have one without the other. As I mentioned before, if you have a strong king and peace in the country, but no temple, you have zero, right? There is no future, there is no Jewish nation. It's going to disappear into history. If you have a great army and you have a beautiful temple, but you have no economy, you have no government, right? You're also going to fall apart. If you have a beautiful temple, a fabulous Beis Hamikdash, a great spiritual center, but if you don't have the other components, the whole thing is going to completely fall apart. All three of these elements are absolutely critical, which is why it took time, right? It took time to make this happen. Each mitzvah is a progressive advance in Jewish nationhood. First, the internal affairs of the Jewish people had to be in order with the king. Second, the foreign affairs of the Jewish people had to be settled with the army, defeating Amalek. And now we have the ability to pursue our religious pursuits in the fullest possible way with the permanent temple. So this is the type of thing that took time. Number one, it's very important to point out that the Jewish people were not devoid of religious pursuits. The Jewish people were not empty of Torah, of mitzvahs, of any type of sanctuary. They had a Mishkan. They had a portable temporary sanctuary. A permanent sanctuary could not be built until the internal and the foreign affairs were taken care of. And it's the portable sanctuary that actually moved around 5 different times as the nation grew, as the nation matured, as the nation achieved each of these various goals. The sanctuary that Moshe made, having been built in the desert and transported from place to place, was a temporary sanctuary, a tent of meeting. This form of the sanctuary continued after the people entered the land, so long as they lived there in a transient manner. That is, the 14 years that they conquered and divided the land. Next, from there they came to Shiloh, when the Jewish people were more settled in the land, having already conquered it and divided it, and they built a house of stone. No longer was it a temporary tent, as it had been until this point, but rather a long-standing one. The Mishkan at Shiloh stood for 369 years. But still, When Eli died, it was destroyed, and they came to Nov and built a sanctuary there. And when Shmuel died, it was destroyed, and they came to Givon. And the days of Nov and Givon were 57 years. Because the people hadn't yet achieved true peace, the sanctuary at Nov and Givon was not a full temple. That only happened when they came from Givon to the eternal temple, because at that time they had a real king in David and Solomon, and also had achieved true peace from the war against Amalek. So spirituality, Torah mitzvahs, the Mishkan was there every step of the way, but you can't really say that it was permanent. You can't say it was permanent until the king internally, the army and peace, right, externally paved the way to allow for a secure, permanent home, spiritual center for the Jewish people with the temple. So why have such a lengthy wait on political affairs to build the permanent temple? The temple was the ultimate divine sanctuary. It developed in stages, analogous to the development of our nationhood. So what's the message for all of us? The message could be understood by asking the question, is Judaism a nation or is Judaism a religion? Now, the answer, of course, is both. On the one hand, the Jewish people are a nation, right? We are the nation of Israel. We have a land, we have a country. We're supposed to have a king, we're supposed to have an army, right? These are all things which make us into a nation. On the other hand, we are absolutely a religion. Torah, mitzvahs, spirituality, right? We're meant to have a temple. That's absolutely what the Jewish people are about. Now, today, the Jewish people do possess the land of Israel to a certain degree, but definitely not to the degree as described in the Torah of having a king and a powerful army that has defeated all of its enemies, which would allow us to build a permanent Beis Hamikdash in Jerusalem. We're not there yet. However, the mitzvah still applies to each and every one of us at every time and in all place. That means in our own life, the message of having a king, the message of an army and peace, and the message of building a temple has to apply. How do we apply it to ourselves? Well, number one, we have to recognize in our life, we have to be like a king. What does that mean? We have to have a law and order in our own life. That means we have to be organized, we have to be responsible, we have to be a mensch. You got to go to work, you got to pay your bills, you got to show up to places on time, right? Internally, we got to be organized. We have to have goals, we have to have strategies on how to achieve those goals. We have to be the king of our own life. We have to be in control, we have to have the power to make sure that internally we're healthy people functioning the way that we need to be. So number one, we are the king of our own life. Number two, there has to be an army, right? An army has to do with foreign affairs. That means we have to have healthy relationships with the people that are in our lives. We have to have healthy relationships with other people. There has to be peace with the people in our household, with the people in our shul, with the people in our community, with the people in our workplace. We have to be dedicated to help others. So internally, there has to be a king. We have to be a king of ourselves to function like a mensch. And externally, right, we have to make sure that there is peace. Peace between us, our families, our neighbors, our friends, our communities. And finally, there has to be a permanence to the temple in our life, to the spirituality in our life, to the Torah and mitzvahs, because it's these values that ultimately is what makes everything else meaningful. Right? It's these values that really fuel and give meaning and purpose to everything that we do in life. So we have to apply these three mitzvahs to our own lives as well. King, peace, temple, Torah, and mitzvahs at the core. Right? Any question? Oh, first, before that, God willing, next week's class will be live 7:30 p.m. on Tuesday. On that Tuesday, my wife and I will be flying back from New York. right? We're going to be at the Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute. God willing, it'll all go well. And we should have the class live. That's the plan. I can't guarantee it because you never know what happens. But the plan is next week to be 7:30 live. Tomorrow, February 2nd, begins our next JLI course, Meditation from Sinai, Mindful Awareness and Divine Spirituality to help you think, feel, and live more deeply. A tremendously practical class, translating some of the most incredible Jewish wisdom into practical tools for everyday living. There is still time to sign up. You can come tomorrow to the first class for free, even if you didn't sign up. It's exactly the same link for this class. Tell your friends. I'd love to see you. All right, any questions, comments on anything that we learned today so far? All right, if not, we'll stop the recording.